Chapter 16. Our Last Goodbyes. Despite what Kenneth said about losing his enthusiasm for his art, he was busy creating something new only days after the unveiling of Neptune's Daughter. The art critics had given it wonderful reviews, and he was featured in several magazines and newspapers. Neptune's Daughter was delivered to the museum as Kenneth had promised, and later I discovered he had permitted Judge Childs to buy it and donate it. Holly remained after the festivities. I joined them for dinner twice over the following 10 days, and once I took May for a bike ride out to the beach, and we had lunch with Holly. I saw that Carrie was right. She and Kenneth had grown closer. They both seemed very happy. Carrie was working on the detailing of Kenneth's sailboat. The equipment had arrived, and he was installing it all himself. A projected maiden voyage was proposed, one that would take the four of us for a day's trip. The boat was in the water now, and people from town who had heard about it from Kenneth were coming around to see it. Mr. Loghorp, a banker, was interested enough in Carrie's work to initiate a discussion about his building him a boat too. Carrie began to design another boat, and we were all very excited for him. I told Grandma Olivia, but she just said it was something only men who had money and time to waste would find interesting. Nothing that involved recreation was important to her. She considered entertainers, sports figures, and the like to be frivolous people who had just not yet grown up. When I talked further with her about it, I understood these were ideas that she'd inherited from her father, but ideas she clung to like a holy rod to help her pass through the trials and tribulations in her mind were the realities this life bestowed upon us. She believed religiously that the Creator put us on this earth just to be tested, just to suffer and endure. That was the closest she came to any religious affiliations. Although she entertained the minister and made contributions to the local church, she never ended a lecture or an explanation without referring to the importance of protecting the family, guarding the reputation. That was the only armor we had to ward off the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. I was beginning to think that she might not be all wrong. A mutual respect and kind of truce had developed between us, especially as it looked almost certain now that I would be class valedictorian. She had arranged for me to have an interview with the headmistress at one of the New England prep schools. In her mind, I was following her prescription for the perfect life, and she was preparing me to walk in her footsteps. As the school year moved to its final quarter, plans for the annual variety show were being developed, and I was approached by the show's director to perform again. I agreed, and we began rehearsals soon afterward. The night of the second rehearsal, I came to the shoot, expecting to find Raymond waiting as usual. He wasn't there yet, but it wasn't because he was late. My part had ended earlier, and I decided to step out to get some fresh air while I waited. I noticed an automobile across the street and a man sitting behind the steering wheel. For a few moments, I stood gazing at the man in the car without fully realizing who it was. When the realization came, I felt as if I stepped into a pool of ice water. My legs actually turned numb. He rolled the window down and beckoned to me. I didn't move, and he beckoned more, empathetically. There was no one else around. I hesitated and then crossed the street. And Teddy Jackson, my real father, smiled at me and nodded. I've been here looking for the opportunity to speak to you, he said. Ever since you sent Adam to me. Can we talk for a few minutes? I glanced at my watch. Raymond wouldn't be here for at least another 15 minutes, I thought. I shrugged. Why? We both know you know why, he said, holding his smile. He stopped smiling when I didn't move. Please. He leaned over and opened the passenger side door. I went in the car. Well, he began, both of us looking forward and not at each other. I think I rehearsed and replayed this conversation in my mind 1,000 times. He turned to me. How did you finally find out? What difference does it make? I countered. I was under the impression Haley never told anyone. It was a secret that she took with her to her grave. Did someone else tell you? I looked at him, my eyes burning with the fire in my heart. You're afraid someone else in this town may expose you, is that it? I shot back at him. He stared and then looked through his windshield again. I have a family, a wife who doesn't know any of this. A very successful legal practice. I have some reason to be afraid, he admitted. However, I don't feel good about that. I don't like continuing to be a coward, especially when I see how well you've turned out, how beautiful and talented you are. I'd like to stake claim to you. I'm not a piece of property, some acre of land or something to possess, I said. You don't stake claim on a daughter. I didn't mean it to sound that way. What I meant was, I'd like to be proud of you too. You didn't tell Adam anything, but he was quite upset. He didn't know what to think. What did you tell him? I didn't. The coward won out in me again, he said. I acted just as confused. He's smart though. He didn't buy it. And one of these days, he and I are going to have a heart-to-heart. I guess he won't think it's so wonderful to be a Jackson then, he added a bit mournfully. He's spoiled and arrogant, I said. He needs to be brought down a few pegs, maybe a dozen. Yes, he is something of a snob. I will definitely stake claim to that. That's my fault. He paused and gazed at me and then nodded. I guess I owe you some sort of an explanation. I don't want anything from you, I said. I'd like to tell you some of it, please. I said nothing. I just sat there, half wanting to lunge out of the car and half wanting to lunge at him and demand why he was such a coward all these years. I wanted to pound his chest and pummel his face and scream and scream and scream about the lies and the deceptions and the people who suffered while he built his precious law practice and wonderfully secure family. Nearly 19 years ago, I was a lot less mature than I am now. Not any less than other men my age, he added. But I was impulsive and full of myself. My career had begun. I was successful rather quickly, which isn't always a good thing, but in my case, I handled it well, invested well, built more and more of fortune, married a beautiful woman, and had my first child. Your mother, he continued with a smile, was the most attractive young woman in this town then, and very seductive. She had a way of directing herself at you, and that kind of melted your resistance, filled you with fantasies. She was, he said with a laugh, a terrific flirt. I don't want to hear any more about her wild ways, I said. Every man I've spoken to who has known her talks about her as if she waved a magic wand over them and hypnotized them. That's not far from the truth. So, you don't bear any blame, is that it? I fired back at him. It was all her fault. She seduced you, and since she seduced you, you had felt no obligations. Tears burned in my eyes, and my heart thumped like a tiny hammer in my chest. No, I'm not going to say that, although I did rationalize it that way for a long time. He replied calmly. I let her blame someone else and cause problems for the Logan family. It was an easy way out for me, and I took it. Why did she do that? I asked. Why didn't she just expose you? I pleaded with her not to, but I think she had other reasons for doing it. She didn't do it for me. It had more to do with her relationship with Olivia Logan and the rest of that family. In short, I lucked out and left it that way. I don't think you want to know the gritty details, he continued. Suffice it to say, we had a few passionate rendezvous and, well, the rest you know. Yes, the rest I know, I said, reaching for the door handle. Wait, I didn't just come to tell you all that. I'd like to do something for you, he blurted. Oh, like what? I don't know. Isn't there something you need, something I can buy you? Buy me a real mother and father, I said. Buy me a real family with people who love and care for each other. He shook his head. I'm sorry. I wouldn't do any good, least of all the Logans. If I stepped forward and confessed, would it? No. Your confession has been made Your confession has to be made to a higher authority. I paused after opening the door and turned back. There's one thing you can do for me. Name it, he added quickly. Keep Adam away from me, I said. Done. And Melanie, I'm really sorry, he said. Just as I stepped out of the car, Raymond appeared in the limousine, and I hurried across the street and got in without looking back until we had turned around and were heading back to Grandma Olivia's. My father was still there, parked, staring ahead into the darkness of his own making. It took me forever to fall asleep that night. I tossed and turned, my mind fuzzy, full of mists that rolled like the fog. How pathetic my real father had sounded to me. Well, all his explanations, his promises and good intentions wouldn't keep the ocean from washing over deceit. Let it all be swept out to sea where it belongs, I thought. Let me be free of the past that wanted to chain me to despair. I was exhausted, and the next day moved through my classes like a zombie. Teresa kept asking me if I was all right. She thought my mood might have something to do with Carrie, because she herself had just broken up with her boyfriend. I kept telling her it was nothing like that, but she refused to believe me. When you're ready to talk, call me, she said, actually a bit put off. I had the feeling I was caught in between those webs of confusion that prevented you from doing or saying anything right. It was better just to retreat into a cocoon of silence and wait for it to pass. When I saw Carrie that afternoon, he read my face quickly as plans for a new yacht. More trouble with Grandma Olivia, he guessed. No, we circled each other from a safe distance these days, like two wolves in silent agreement to each other's territory. He laughed. So? I pondered a moment. I had come out with him to Kenneth's dock to keep him company while he completed the finishing touches on the cabin. It was really a magnificent boat and comfortable inside, as he had predicted. He turned from the wiring he was doing on the stove and gazed at me with those green eyes fully focused. What is it, Melanie? Have you heard from your mother? Hardly, I said with a laugh. I'd expect to hear from the Queen of England first. Then what? When I wouldn't answer, he turned, putting his tools aside. If you and I can't trust each other by now with our deepest secrets and feelings, we'll never trust each other, he said. I gazed at him lovingly, appreciatively. I was lucky to have him, to have someone so devoted to me, I thought. Why would any of Grandma Olivia's so-called young men of distinguished families had half of Carrie's love for me? Or would they just see me as a part of the puzzle constructed to make them look successful in the eyes of their parents and friends? As he could read my thoughts, Carrie added, I love you, Melanie, and loving you means feeling pain when you feel it, being sad when you're sad and happy when you're happy. I nodded. He waited as I took a deep breath. Carrie, I know who my real father is, I said, and he lives here in Providence Town. He stared at me and slid up against the cabinet to sit on the floor and face me. Who? He asked, holding his breath. It's Teddy Jackson, I revealed. For a moment he just sat there stunned, blinking rapidly, his face unchanged. Then the realization began to sink in and his mouth opened slightly, his eyes darkening. You mean that skunk, that shark, that ocean scum is your half-brother, he said. I nodded. How did you find out? Mommy finally told me before I left Los Angeles, I said. And you kept it a secret all this time? I didn't want to believe it or face up to it. I did my best to avoid him and my half-sister, Michelle, who ironically despises me. I thought I could bury it with all the other lies. What happened? I told him about my meeting, my father, the night before. He listened, smirked, and nodded. In character, I'm sorry, but I have to confess something too, he said. I have to confess that I'm happy. Happy? Happy about Teddy Jackson being my real father? Adam and Michelle being my half-brother and half-sister? He looked down on the floor. There were times, because of the things he said, the remarks he had made, and times the way he treated you and your mother, that I feared, suspected. He looked up at me. I was terrified my father was your father. What? I started to smile and stopped, realizing how horrible it must have been for him to have lived with such an idea. I thought that was what he really had to confess to you that day in the hospital when he called you to his deathbed. But if I knew that, Carrie, do you think I would have permit us to be lovers? I hoped not, but it was a nightmare of mine. Well, I thought about it too, I said. We're distant enough cousins, so it doesn't matter, I stated firmly. You say that now, but Grandma Olivia has your life plotted like a chart for a sea voyage. Don't you think I know why she wants you to be refined and attend those snob schools? It doesn't matter what she wants. I'm tired of worrying about what other people want and expect of me. You were right when you said we should start thinking about the present and ourselves and not drag up the past anymore, I told him. He smiled so warmly and lovingly, I wanted to rush into his arms. Once again, he sensed my deepest feelings and rose to me. Without a concern in the world, I put up my resistance. We made love to each other on that sparkling new sofa. He was holding me and rocking me, driving me from the places of sadness in my heart as I could go. I thought of nothing but his lips and his fingers. Then he rose slowly and sat up, gazing down at me. I lifted my hand to his lips to stop him. No, don't apologize. Don't say anything, Carrie. I'm not upset. He smiled. It would have been a lie if I said I'm sorry anyway, he admitted, and we laughed. And then we heard the sound of a dog barking excitingly. What's that? It sounds like Prometheus. We better get dressed, he said, fast. We hurried about pulling on our clothes and heard Holly and Kenneth calling. I brushed back my hair quickly and glanced at the wall mirror, but there wasn't time to do much more. They were shouting now. What's going on? Carrie wondered as we climbed up the small stairway to the deck of the boat. Holly and Kenneth were standing at the dock, and in Holly's arms was another chestnut-coated retriever puppy. Prometheus was circling and barking. He's going to be company for Prometheus, she declared. We're calling him Neptune in honor of Kenneth's work. Oh, he's so sweet, I said, hurrying off the boat. She handed him to me, and he covered my face with licking kisses. Everything's coming along all right down there? Kenneth asked Carrie, his eyes moving from him to me and then back to Carrie. Carrie blushed. Just fine, he said. We're still looking at next Saturday then. No problem. I can see, Carrie replied firmly. Okay. When should we do it? Friday? Right, Holly? You're not going to get away that cheaply, Kenneth Childs. Getting away with what that cheaply, I asked. If he thinks for a moment that we're going to consider that a honeymoon. Honeymoon? Carrie and I exclaimed simultaneously. They both beamed at us. Oh, Holly, congratulations, I cried, and we hugged. Neptune squeezed between us. He barked his complaint, which caused Prometheus to join in chorus. It's just going to be a small wedding at my father's house, Kenneth said. Really? It was Holly's idea to let him marry us. I figured I'd save money, so... That's wonderful, Kenneth, I said, my face flushed with happiness for them both. I had a feeling you'd see it that way, he said. Well, I best get back to work. It looks like this piece is going to be interrupted by something called a honeymoon, he declared. Carrie and I watched the two of them walk back to the house. I hope that'll be us someday, he said, and took my hand. It will, I promised. He put his arm around me. Maybe it was changing. Maybe the storms had really passed over us at last, I thought. 2 days later, Carrie drove me up to Grandma Belinda's rest home so I could make our weekly visit with her. Carrie liked to visit Grandpa Samuel. He said at least he got to talk about fishing. I was anxious to tell Grandma Belinda all the good news. It seemed the only baggage I ever brought with me when I visited her were suitcases full of sadness and tragedy. She was still spending lots of time with Mr. Mandel, but this time I found him first in the lobby playing checkers with another man. He recognized me and smiled. Good, you're here, he said. She needs company. I've been trying to beat Mr. Braxton here at checkers all week, but I never get the time. She doesn't let me out of her sight, he explained with a twinkle in his eye. Just his excuse for being afraid of losing me, Mr. Braxton said, blaming that poor old lady. You should be ashamed of yourself, Mandel. We'll soon see who's going to be ashamed, Mr. Mandel replied and jumped one of Mr. Braxton's checkers. Carrie laughed. She's on the beach garden. In the garden, Mr. Mandel told me. Carrie and I split up in the hallway. He was going down to Grandpa Samuel's room first. It was a bright afternoon. The flowers were in full bloom. Lilacs with their dark purple spikes climbed over the walls and the gates. I knew how much Grandma Olivia liked being outside and how she enjoyed soaking in the sunshine and drinking in the wonderful rainbow colors all around her. Hello, Grandma, I said as I approached. Lately she'd begun to remember more and more about me. although she still said very little about my mother and asked no questions. She didn't reply, so I sat beside her and took her hand into mine. The moment I did, a shudder of abject terror passed like an electric current up through my arm and into my heart, which stopped and then started to pound again frantically. Her hand was ice cold. "Grandma?" I shook her. Her body trembled and then stopped. Her eyes remained shut, her lips parted a little more. "Grandma Belinda!" I shook harder, and then I shouted to the nearest attendant for help. "Hurry," I screamed. He ran over. "What's wrong?" "She won't wake up," I said. I knelt by her side and felt for her pulse, opened her eyes, and then he shook his head. "She's gone," he declared as if she had just gotten up and walked away. "Gone? She can't be gone. She's smiling. She's pleased and happy." "I'm sorry," he said. "No, please call the doctor. Call someone." "Take it easy. I'll get Mrs. Green right away," he said. Then he leaned toward me. "She doesn't like us to make too big of a deal when this happens." "I don't care what she thinks. Get a doctor." He stood up. "I'll be right back," he promised and hurried up. "Oh, Grandma Belinda, please don't go. Not yet." I took her cold hand into mine and sat beside her, the tears streaming down my cheeks. I muttered my silent prayer and continued to beg her to stay just a little while longer. Moments later, Mrs. Green came hurrying down the garden pathway, accompanied by 2 other attendants and a nurse. The nurse charged ahead, examined Grandma Belinda, and making the same pronunciations quickly. "Get another stretcher from the infirmary," Mrs. Green ordered the attendants. "Bring it out that side door and take her back that way. I'll call the mortuary." "No!" I cried and buried myself in my hands. "You come into my office if you wish," she told me curtly. "I'll have you call Mrs. Logan right away. Don't worry. Arrangements have been made. We do that immediately after we accept the patient." "How convenient for everyone," I replied as I brushed the tears off my cheeks. She pursed her lips together with annoyance and nodded at the attendants who rushed by. "Stay with her," she ordered the nurse, then pivoted and started to march back to the building. I turned to Grandma Belinda and brushed the back of her hair. The nurse smiled at me. "She died happy, thinking of something nice," she said. "She loved it out here," she added. "I know," I moaned through my tears. "This is better than getting sicker and sicker, lingering in the infirmary," the nurse continued, "more for my sake than Grandma Belinda's." "I have to tell Carrie," I realized aloud and rose. "I'll stay with her," the nurse promised. I glanced down at her again. Her lips were turning purple, and her smile seemed to fade before my eyes. I reached down to touch her one more time, and then, with my chest feeling as if it turned to stone, I started away. Carrie was sitting in Grandpa Samuel's room. Grandpa Samuel was still in bed, sitting up. He was in his robe and unshaven. "He's not talking much," Carrie began, but when his eyes settled on me a moment longer, he knew something terrible had happened. "What is it? You look terrible." "It's Grandma Belinda, Carrie," I wailed. "She's dead. She died in the garden just now, just before I arrived." He got up quickly to embrace me as I sobbed. Grandpa Samuel seemed to finally notice us and slowly came out of his daze. "Laura?" he said. Carrie turned to him. "No, Grandpa, it's Melanie. She just came from Belinda." "I'm afraid it's bad news, Grandpa. Belinda's gone." "Gone?" He looked at me and my tear-streaked face and bloodshot eyes. "I told her not to do it. I told her it was wrong. But she said it was best for everyone." He stared down at his hands and shook his head. She always knew what was best, so what could I say? He's more confused than ever, Carrie explained. What happens now? They're taking her to the infirmary and calling Grandma Olivia. The arrangements have already been made. They were made 5 minutes after she was brought here, I added bitterly. Grandma Olivia thinks of everything, plans, plots, and never misses a beat for fear of the moment embarrassment for her precious family. Carrie nodded. Yet, he said, you appreciate all that at times like this. I hated to admit, but he was right. And to give her credit. Please take me home, I said. Okay, Grandpa, we've got to go now. I'll be back to see you again. Grandpa Samuel turned back to us, his face full of seriousness, his eyes small and dark as he nodded with tight lips. She decided it was best for us, he said, but I'm not so sure. Go down to the basement and you decide, he added. He's just doing a lot of babbling today, Carrie explained. He squeezed Grandpa Samuel's hand softly and patted him on the shoulder and guided me out. We didn't stop at Miss Green's office, nor did we stop at the checker table to tell Mr. Mandel. I thought it was better for him to find out himself. I still felt like I was in a daze. I'm sorry, Carrie said as we drove off. I know how much you wanted to get to know her and have her get to know you. It was starting to happen, Carrie. Each time I visited, she seemed to remember more. I'll go home and tell Ma, he said after we arrived at Grandma Olivia's. Take it easy, I'll call you later. I'll be all right, I said. I found Grandma Olivia in what was Grandpa Samuel's office, talking on the phone. She looked up when I appeared, but continued her conversation with the mortuary. Yes, she said, I want the service short, but I'll stay with the deluxe flower arrangements. No, she added firmly, you can close the coffin immediately. Thank you. She cradled the phone. Actually, I thought she would live longer than I would. She's younger, and nothing bothered her half as much as it bothers me. Maybe you just never saw how much things bothered her. You hardly visited her there, I attacked. Don't use that tone of voice with me. I won't be blamed for trying to protect her and take care of her. One day you'll realize all that, especially when you see how most people look after sick relatives. The country is full of discarded people, she continued. At least I made sure that she died with some dignity and some comfort from professionals looking after her day and night. She didn't belong there. She belonged at home, I wailed. She wasn't crazy. She was just confused. Grandpa Samuel doesn't belong there either. You have enough money to keep him taken care of right here in his own home, in his own surroundings. To do what? Sit around and dribble down his chin? Be carried out and left in a chair on the lawn for everyone to see? None of this so-called croonies would come to see him. Most of them are worse off or dead. It would just be another family embarrassment, prolonged, and even if I couldn't change his condition, at least he has a good medical care, good dietary care, and some companionship where he is. Don't be so quick to make judgments about things you know very little about, she advised sharply. You come late to this family. You have no real idea about the twists and turns and the ridges and the valleys that were crossed, the storms I've weathered. Belinda was always difficult and always a problem in one way or another, and Samuel was no prize, but I did the best for everyone, she concluded firmly. I bear no guilt. Her daughter, that's who bears the guilt. She took a deep breath and for a moment looked pale. Then she gathered her resolve and stood up. There's much more to do, even though I tried to have everything in order. She paused at the doorway and turned to me. "Were you there when it actually happened?" she asked, almost in a soft, concerned tone of voice. "No, she was already gone by the time I found her in the garden." "She was smiling," I said. Grandma Olivia nodded. "She probably thought of the Grim Reaper as just another gentleman caller asking her for a date," she said wistfully. She was a pretty little girl. Everyone always remarked about how perfect her features were. "It won't be long before I'll be taking care of her again. You don't lose your burdens just because you leave this world," she muttered and then left the office. I stood there for a while looking around, thinking and feeling such emotions: sadness, grief, confusion, and sympathy. I went behind the desk and sat. Mommy should know, I thought. She should be told that her own mother had just died. I stared at the phone. I hadn't attempted to contact her once since my return. I had forgotten the phone number. I sucked my breath, lifted the receiver. It rang once, and there was an automated voice. "I'm sorry, but this phone number is no longer in service," I was told. "What?" I dialed again and received the same automated message. Where was she, I wondered. She always emphasized how important a telephone was to someone who was trying to get auditions and parts and assignments. I called the information operator and asked for a forwarding number. She told me there was nothing listed. Frustrated, I thought about calling Mel Jensen and wondered how I would explain not knowing what had happened to the woman who was supposedly my sister. Nevertheless, I finally called and spoke with his roommate because Mel was at an audition. "Gina Simon," he said. "I haven't heard from her for a while, months. I don't know where she went. Matter of fact, I think Mel said something about her running out on her lease and the landlord being after her," he added. "Oh, well, thanks anyway. Do you want me to have Mel call you? Where are you?" "No, it's all right," I said, even more embarrassed. "Just say I wish him luck." "Sure." I hung up and sat there a while thinking about Mommy. She hadn't been much interested in her mother all these years, that her mother was alive as far as I knew. As sad as it was to me, I didn't think she would be upset not finding out when her mother had died. Maybe Grandma Olivia was right. Maybe Grandma Belinda was far better off at a home. At least there no one pretended to be more than he or she was. They took care of you because they were paid to take care of you. And they liked you because they wanted to do something extra. It was honest and simple. Grandma Belinda's funeral was well attended, but not because so many people remembered her. In fact, some of the people thought she had died long ago. People came because it was Grandma Olivia's sister, and Grandma Olivia still commanded great respect in the community. Government officials attended, as did most of the influential business people and professionals. I saw my father and his wife there, but I avoided looking at him as much as possible, and he said nothing to me. Grandma Olivia did not greet the mourners afterwards. We all went to the cemetery, and then the mourners went their separate ways, except for Judge Childs, Kenneth, Holly, Carrie, May, and Aunt Sarah, who returned to the house with us. Grandma Olivia said wakes and feeding large numbers of people only prolonged the final goodbye and delayed getting on with life. Nevertheless, we had something to eat, and afterwards we sat back and talked. Holly took Aunt Sarah for a walk with May along the beach. Holly and Aunt Sarah got along well these days. She was actually helping Aunt Sarah shed her burden of mourning. Grandma Olivia fell asleep in her chair while Carrie talked about the boat with Judge Childs and Kenneth. Finally, Carrie and I went down to the dock and watched the approaching twilight, with the gulls gliding peacefully over the silvery water. I wondered if Holly is right. I wonder if we all return to a spiritual body full of love and start again, I said. Carrie was silent for a moment, then he turned to me and smiled. I started again. I started when you came here, he said. So maybe it is true. Maybe love is what makes us alive. I leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around me, making me feel secure and safe. The sun continued to dip. Clouds drifted toward the horizon as if they were sinking too. The gulls cried out through the shadows. And I said a soft goodbye to grandmother I had hardly known, but whose soft eyes filled me with promises to keep.